You want it on the first page? Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Father Gabriel Pavarnik. I am the Director for the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies and the Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Providence College. I'm happy to say that today for our St. Thomas Aquinas lecture, not only do we have those of you gathered here, but because we're live streaming, there are people now in Spain watching this presentation. So hello, Carlos, glad to see you. I promised a shout out to you and I've done it. Each year, the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies hosts 4 endowed lectures as part of the Quinn Family Lecture Series. And this Aquinas lecture is part of that series. So we're thankful for the Quins for their endowment and what they've allowed us to do within the center for these 4 endowed lectures. It's my pleasure to welcome here today Brother Sixto Castro, a Dominican brother of ours from Spain at the University of Valladalloid. He is a professor of philosophy technically, but his area of specialty is in aesthetics, and both in aesthetic philosophy and aesthetic theology. He is the author of at least 7 books that I can tell, and more articles than you can count. Over 45, I think, at last rendering of your CV. On top of that are the numerous reviews that he's done for different texts and books, and his ability to research and to write is unparalleled within his own province, and indeed, I would say, within the order. It's my pleasure to welcome then Brother Sixto Castro as our Aquinas lecturer for this year. Brother Sixto.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today to give this Aquinas lecture. I want to thank especially Father Gabriel Pivarnik for his invitation and for his kindness in arranging everything to make this event possible. I want to extend my gratitude to the academic community of Providence College and to the Quinn family who make these talks possible. I'm really happy for this invitation to speak here. Since the time I was a student brother in the order, I have always thought of this Dominican university as the perfect place to develop a Dominican life of study and research. It's a real challenge to be here today, but it's a challenge that fills me with joy. So thank you very much. The title of my talk, Art as Theology as Art, Current Insights into Aesthetic Theology, tries to capture the very special relationship existing between art and religion on one hand, and between theology and the theory of art on the other. The relation between art and religion seems to be clear. Modern philosophers of art, especially from the continental tradition, agree that art can make somewhat present what otherwise would be unpresentable. Aesthetic ideas, the constitutive element of the work of art, offer and veil at the same time, show some content and claim that that content is not the whole thing, and reveal the radiance hidden under the apparent evidence of the visible. Correspondingly, the aesthetic experience of the works of art is eminently contemplative in a deeply religious sense. It involves a radical openness to what is experienced and the opening up to the appearance of the phenomenon. Some philosophers, like Roger Scruton, for example, have followed this path. Currently, some thinkers have thought the artwork as a space of resistance to the inclination to control and submit the real in general, and the divine in particular, through a way of knowing and understanding it that encapsulates and dominates art, and to its intentional character in any religious life. Alice Murdoch, for example, has noted how some Christian isolation painters to have become the ultimate in that as well the poets and Greek gods. Murdoch speaks particularly about the Christian representation of the Trinity, whom we can hear as more than centuries of metaphysical arguments in favor of the intelligibility of this dogma. The same can be said about the aesthetic representations of the eschatological blessing and the torments of hell. They both are something that have to be painted or poetized rather than conceptualized. For example, Dante's eschatological view in the divine deeply influences not only art, but also the theological thinking. The devotion to the Virgin Mary is substantiated in the arts long before than it happens in dogmatics. Along with the areas in which art precedes theology and in some occasions exceeds it, and images to concepts, we have artistics that come after theological concept and have maintained its theological force even once their theological origins become somewhat blurred. We can see this, for example, in the American painting landscapes in 19th century, intended to be painted theology, trying to depict nature as a second scripture that reveals God's power and sublimity. And we have, last but not least, the example of music that has so often been a locus theologicus. This is obvious in Karl Barth's work with regard to Mozart's music, the same in Gerard van der Leeuw's regarding Bach's. They both recall Luther's understanding of music as a predicatio sonora, a preaching in songs, not just a voice for the revealed text, but as a glint of God's beauty and soul to reveal truths that cannot be in words. We have two different ways of approaching what we call today aesthetic categories. One aesthetic approach is through art, beautiful or not. Insofar art is understood as a non-reductive way to approaching the real. Art, once we regain it from its aesthetic reduction, that is, art as something whose only function is to be contemplated in order to get a purely aesthetic experience, provides us with a specific form of knowledge. This is an idea that Gadamer dedicated a lot of time to developing. Levinas, on the other hand, points out that art allows us to experience the being with other. In other words, while one does not experience the holy other of religion, one does have the ability to recall the dimension of that experience. Art enriches our experience and satisfies our hunger of experiencing all imaginable and possible visions. And in so doing, it's the feeling of community by means to experience that which otherwise would be incommunicable. So it is a constitutive element in any religious form of life. Art, insofar as it provides the experience of aesthetic meaning, infers the possibility of God's real sense, George Steiner has said. The other aesthetic approach is through beauty. This has widely been developed by the Neoplatonic tradition, Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, Aquinas, the Florentine Neoplatonics, etc. This conviction of the theological character of beauty grounds the aesthetic arguments for the existence of God, from the inference from natural beauty posed by Joseph Addison to Kant's acknowledgement that the contemplation of natural beauty is as close to the argument from design to prove the existence of God as we should ever come. It offers something less than justification, but it produces something more than hope, as Susan Neiman has said. All the aesthetic proofs of the existence of God, as they proposed in the 30s by Frederick Robert Tennant, from the aesthetic pleasure that nature rises in every person, regardless of their education of taste, follow this intuition. This insight is also in the origin of the cosmological argument and the question, why is there something instead of nothing? I'm sure all these insights are known to everybody, so I'm not going to focus on them. I'd like to provide some remarks in order to understand why that intimate relationship is possible. I'm concerned by how it's for religiouses. An author who is an example of this approach is the Spanish philosopher José María Valverde, who in 1959, just before Council Vatican II, wrote a delightful book on this topic with the title Letters to a Skeptical in Modern Art. What I want to focus on is the very fact intimate relationship between art and religion, and for that matter, between theology and philosophy of art. That which is the core of what I'm calling aesthetic theology. So my topic is not how art and religion relate, but that art and religion relate. Not so long ago, I was doing some research on this at University in New York. Every day I passed by the statue of Alma that is located in the center of the main campus. Alma is the popular name of the image that represents the goddess Athena, which is the symbol of the university, to which we refer to in Latin as Alma. In the back of the statue, here, rather hidden and not easy to appreciate, is the motto of the university, Lumine tuo videbimus lumen, somewhere here. The arting and the concealed location allow us to infer that very few people will have paid attention to this inscription. Even so, one eye to take a picture and has rulings of Latin, translating will probably attribute the lumine tuo either to Alma as the incarnation of the university or to the university itself, which is the nurturing mother who is the light of understanding. For a reference, however, is Psalm 36. For a learned monk in century and this university, the lumen of the mother refers immediately to God, whose light makes it possible to see the light. Being aware of that reference is part of the culture of the time, but not any longer. I'm pretty sure that most students, probably even academics who can read Latin, will logically make the textual interpretation already pointed out. The university is the source that provides us with the light that allows us to acquire knowledge. The religious element has arisen, and yet the motto was spread away. The references are different. The discourse is equally valid and the new parameters in the new technical paradigm, even though it says something different. This transmutation is the element of what I am calling aesthetic, namely the shifting of the space of the religious and artistic, the settling of some of the aspects of religion into art, and finally the understanding of art theological categories. Art and religion show similarities of those that led Hegel to speak of religion of art, their structure. This will make it possible to think about the means of the same categories as the theological, in my view. Art and religion split in different spaces of 18th century, according to Oscar Christler's view of the origin of the modern of the arts. An intrinsic relationship did not exist. It was said something like intrinsicness. So it's possible to understand the spiritual third currently in art, which emerged some decades ago. Contemporary art, in many cases, tries to transfix daily realities, even now to veil some sort of enlightening or station. Besides, the language makes it possible to understand artistic and religious are often essential. Sometimes we need to be in a specific cultural, theoretical, institutional context in order to know whether we must something artistic or religious, and that's also to our experience of all works of art. Sometimes it's just a question of shifting perspectives in order to make it possible for us to conceive religious or as an artisticity. That means that in either case, we build and demand different descriptions and predicates. The question is, John of the Cross Spiritual Canticle, a work of art or a religious profession? What is one of Bach's cantatas? When we listen to Tomás Luis de Victoria de Functorum, are we attending a church of religion or are we praying, rather for the soul of the departed? Can we decide between these two apparent incompatible choices if we consider that art and religion belong to different cultural spaces? It's imperceptible in the prayer as such that forces one in one's or another. The cult might take place in a church, the religious office, funeral of a famous person. Today, some consider Victoria to be a mystic. That would make him akin to St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa, Meister Eckhart, or maybe even Thomas Merton. This connection allows us to understand him within the context of the world of mystics. And in so doing, some features and characters of his music arise. Now, the work opens up a world and opens itself to a world. On the contrary, other people consider him to be just an artist. That links him to Velázquez, Warhol, or Ai Weiwei. He is thereby used to construct the art world. This scheme as an artist allows us to make purely formalist, where Fra Angelico painted the cells for the friars with the same attitude as we visit our city's main museum of art. However, Fra Angelico did not paint these walls for the aesthetic delectation of tourists, but for the friars to live within them, so that these images were for them a memorial of the tradition they belonged to, also an icon for them to pray before. That is, he painted them as an element of a religious form of life. His painting and their praying can both be understood as a religious act. Bach's little organ book, Orgelbüchlein, is a set of choral preludes beginning with this text that we have here. And part says, or reads, "For the glory of the Most High God alone, and for my neighbor from." This is a pedagogical above workers' worship, to teach Bach's students technique to play the organ, and also to worship God in the liturgical service. To some scholars, it's somology. What happens if we do away with all the theological and liturgical elements that form part of the preludes, that we just pay attention to the book number, work, and we forget that situates it in the liturgical cycle, for example? Of course, a mere formal or aesthetic reading work is possible. Currently, it might be thought to be the norm. In adopting this artistic point of view focused on formal elements, pure music arose on the aesthetic, this music might have to do without some elements. But how could anyone say that performing to one of these is not a religious act in its own way of thinking about it, considering the artistic actions taking over and embellish itself like that. The right one, in my view, is to consider as a religious act as such. Greek institutive religious element of this work, we really say any of these artworks is so valuable as we just say it is. I usually try to shock my students with a thought experiment. I suggest they visit El Prado and try to pray out loud, way clear enough so that there is no doubt they are praying before an image Christ and religious or any other religious paint, the last acquisition of El Prado. It's odd to imagine something so shocking and at the same time so sensible. Why does students consider the possibility of doing that? If one of them tried the museum, he would probably kindly invited to leave the place. Should he be smart enough, he can play as a kind of artistic performance. And maybe he will even get some renown with the world as a genuine performer. By thought experiment, I intend to show that there is no difference between an artistic painting and a religious icon, perspective, or the other in virtue of some theoretical, contextual, and institutional elements. There is a tendency other times to categorize everything. We are driven to find a particular spot or category where any reality can be located. We live in a world, the medieval idea that there are transcendental realities has become exclusive categorical world. By this I mean we are forced to choose that thing is every issue was a category. Nothing can be one thing, either art or religion, never both. Once religion is split two different autonomous spheres, we are to choosing for dilemma. Now something can only be namely, can only include a way of being yours in which classifications seem to reflect underlying ontologies. However, this is a very old idea. Art and religion are completely different domains in the 18th century. It is the moment where a whole system of concepts, practices, and institutions is substituted by other. There are institutions that new space, history, museums, artists, market of artists, and so on. The artist with features of originality, inspiration, imagination, ability to create, and so on, which is the difference between the artist and the artisan. Besides, the aesthetic character is different and instrumental. It opens up possible the reformulation of the idea of taste to the reduction of the aesthetic attitude to a mere relative, intellectual, and is a sacred attitude. A disinterested contemplation recalls the ode before only to God. Understood as entity becomes a fixed archetype that judges of performance or an demands fidel independent for specification, its production or purpose. In the case of, for example, the Eurydice was saying, written for specific occasions, begin to be transported to a catalog number that substitutes heading that marginal purpose. This procedure of cataloging pulls up words that throws it into a situation is around by other works and by works of art in general. And so its natural environment is supposed to be just a pure musical, artistic atmosphere. In this process of the artwork is identified with the representation of beauty, not beauty anymore, but the artistry of beauty. As Lessing claims, Kuhn, artworks that's beauty, but something else shouldn't be caught. Meaning something old but born in our age will be expelled of art. New art will be considered from now on at best as auxiliary art. The aesthetic arts artwork kept its own world. It is its not a divine beauty anymore. Before this aestheticness was formed and the model concept of art was created, people were surrounded by creations whose religious or secular function anyone, but with no urge in favor of a late aesthetic contemporarity. The image of God one day presided over a temple, and artwork contemplated, a basic part of a world temple inhabited by the god makes that religious form of life possible and contains the world of the religions from which it comes. That is supposed to be the religious role of the image in our churches. Thus, a religious form of life, art is not just art, but a religious element. Simone Weil wrote, I quote, "A Gregorian melody full of witness of a martyr," end of quote. And annunciation is an element as religious praying fests. Well, Dominicans can remember our Father Saint Dominic and his ways of praying, among which was included for studying and traveling. So when Dominicans travel or study, we are also. Religion is therefore not just a genus that is different religions as a religion is basically a form of life that comprises ways of eating to others, creating modes of family and society, of serving rituals, creating calendars, establishing of celibacy as well as specific beliefs, of course. It does not belong just to the subjective phase, but also to the objectives in which social practices are institutionalized. Just like art of cultural reality, religion can be considered as a sphere in orthodox and just Marley's terms, evolving in the world, even accurately described by using just a vocabulary restricted to the material world. Of course, as in other domains, it has a realm. That is a fact. But that has also, as a consequence, the concept of religion has changed. Currently, many authors present the cognitive elements and only these define its religious identity. This involves leaving out all those other elements that constitute religion, including the ethical stance. By so doing, religion is reduced to being a more or less rational set of beliefs. However, no thinker for antiquity would being able or was the aesthetic quality of the objects from their place to their world, nor would have intended to use aesthetic quality as a criterion to group these objects under the category of arts, or to turn into a matter of philosophical interpretation. No one have considered that the painting of a crucifixion was not a religious act in itself, within the variety of charismas constituting a religious form of. In order to make this change of consciousness possible, we need to reconfigure the appreciation of the artwork in its previous terms, as well as, and this is important, to present this way of accessing the work of art as superior. Under this paradigm, art will be strength, and it will become a somewhat new form of religion, one more acceptable to modern people. It would to provide meaning for humankind that religion, understood now as something completely different from art, provide anymore. In relation to what has been called by different authors the eclipse of the sacred, the withdrawal of the divine art with a capital A in modernity is a purely religious phenomenon. It no longer serves a certain religious ideas it was supposed to have been in other historical moments. Rather, that one process of the differentiation of modernity culminated by virtue of which art and religion follow different processes as cultural category. Art will assume itself part of the content of religion, be itself a kind of religion, or perhaps the religion, the only worship that seems appropriate for a new era. Art becomes priests, the museum becomes the temple, artistic rituals evoke charismatic theories appropriate, the religious aura becomes an artistic property, and finally, controversies surrounding whether something is art or not become authentic theological debates that them not only the theological concepts, but also the affections that always surround these arguments. To give just a couple of examples, the German artist Gerhard Richter writes in 64-65, I quote, "Art is not a substitute religion, it is a religion in the true sense of the word, binding back, binding to the unknowable, transcending reason, transcendent being. This does mean that art has turned into something the church taking over its function, but the church is no longer adequate as a means of affording experience of the transcendental and of making religion real. And so, he says, art has been transformed from a means into the sole provider of religion, which means religion itself." End of quote. In order to view a striking example of this, I strongly recommend Matthew Akers and Jeff Bray documentary The Artist on the work of Marina Abramovic, where she is depicted in quasi-religious terms. Well, the example is taken from the words in the note of a humanist chaplain at Harvard who the of Holocaust survivors and child of atheists says, I quote, "I try to believe that humans must art. We worshipped this and books. The Bible was everything from Neil Simon to the Russian novelists." End of quote. Both Eric and George Steiner have read largely on this phenomenon of substitute or search and viceroy for God. This process has slowly percolated in the 18th century onwards. The last step of this process, in my view, is when theological vocabulary has taken over philosophy of art. Carl Schmitt begins his famous text, Political Theology, with the statement that all significant concepts of the modern theory of state secularized theological concepts. These basic concepts lead from theology to the theory, where they have exercised new functions and served as a means of articulating political. The omnipod became the omnipotent lawgiver. God's law is now the positive law, and so on. These concepts weave a network that often is incomprehensible if we forget their logical ancestry. Because of that, thinkers raise philosophical questions that theology had resolved a long time ago, but by so doing, they contribute to reshape them. This phenomenon occurs as well in aesthetic theory of art. The vast majority of basic concepts of the modern theory of the arts are actually secularized concepts. The theological discourse on the art reflects the experience, the account of the creative process, as well as the role of in art. Other major issues still have theological profiles, although their proponents are aware of this fact. Philosophers of art no longer apply just analogies and just examples. They can use the whole armory of concepts to think about the work of art. It is no longer artists or intellectuals who want to propose a secular substitute to religion, as it happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now they have taken us further. The work of art is regarded by means of theories, doctrines, and theological concepts that serve, of course, to explain religious realities, institutions, and form of life. Maybe this is a new phase in the conversion of art in privileged mode of incarnating human spirituality to secular art. Obviously, theology of art as such has not disappeared. There is still an explicit theological way of thinking about art, a theology of art or of the arts, as well as a theology of beauty. Several contemporary authors have reflected on the fact that aesthetics and theology, as attempts to understand respectively beauty, art, and God, and everything that is ordered to God according to the Thomist account, converge in our reflection on the divine and aesthetic categories. It seems also obvious, however, that place theology in the intellectual space has been considerably diminished contrary, the disciplines that have incorporated theological concepts and theological modes of reasoning into their own structure in a certain way have become secular theologies do not cease to increase their importance and precision in that same space of debate. There's an author who, in my view, is a couple of these, Arthur, professor at Columbia, whose most important work, which embodies his ontology of the work of art, has the theological title of The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. The whole philosophy of Danto tries to show that between things that are art and things that are not art, there is an ontological difference. But it has not to be a perceptually discernible difference. What one thing is cannot be decided just by means of the eye. We need something else. In order to find this something else that underpins his philosophy of art, Danto uses a series of typically theological concepts such as transubstantiation, transfiguration, grace, as well as eschatological approaches, which, released from their transcendent references, allow him to understand the work of art in particular and the art world in general. Danto does not do this in a premeditated and conscious way. On the contrary, it is precisely the fact that he does so without intending it that confirms the idea that we have reached a particularly significant moment in that process of occupation of the religious space by art, with a capital A, in the secular world. It is a moment that eventually had to arrive, the moment when art and religion are thought through the same theological ones. The theoretical element to concept divine, that theology is not of art. We could call this discourse art theology, something like that. But it does not seem like a term that will have great philosophical success. Rather, following Schmidt's intuition, we might call it, as I've been doing, aesthetic theology. It is, so to speak, the revenge that theology takes on those who believe that its time is over and past. I do not claim the whole philosophy of art can be considered aesthetic theology, but there are enough elements in many of the great contemporary theorists to support the idea that there has been a theological turn in the contemporary philosophy of art. I insist, not because its theme is mainly theological, and as it is said to be the case in the theological twist of French phenomenology, but because, as I insist, the way of conceptualizing non-theological reality is typically theological. I want to show this by briefly focusing on Dante's thought. In order to do this, I'm taking advantage of some ideas that I have worked through in a contribution that will appear this year in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, and in a companion devoted to this author to be published by Wiley Blackwell. This is interesting because I was asked to work on one of his main concepts, that of transfiguration. But in exchange of ideas with the editors, we decided I should work on transfiguration and transubstantiation. This change of mind clearly shows, in my view, the main idea of aesthetic theology. One of the main concerns of Dante was to show that in many occasions, things which look exactly the same are really different. The main idea that presides over his whole philosophy of art. What makes something a work of art is not something the eye can see. But we have to look for the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a work of art somewhere else. The idea that we can recognize something as art just by pointing it out ceased to be useful the moment in which works of art started to look exactly like ordinary things. So from the very beginning of his philosophy of art, Dante, in his famous paper, The Art World, 1964, invokes theological references, like, for example, this idea of transfiguration, as well as Gaussian theology of history, depicted in The City of God, to explain this kind of double citizenship of artworks. His main concern here and throughout his work are Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. Why are they works of art if they are indiscernible from the banal and ordinary soap boxes created by James Harvey as a piece of industrial design which anyone can buy in the supermarket? In later works, Dante will add to this pair, Warhol-Harvey, a third indiscernible artwork created by Mike Bitlow with the title No Andy Warhol Brillo Boxes. So it's impossible for me to distinguish which one is Andy Warhol, which one is Mike Bitlow. There are no aesthetic differences between them, but two of them are different works of art, and the third is not. The former are ontologically different from the latter, and those two works of art are different works of art. There is nothing the eye can grasp to account for those differences. Danto thinks this is not a problem only for the theory of art. Rather, it's a key problem in the history of philosophy, and a multidisciplinary one. We find it in metaphysics, epistemology, moral philosophy, and so on. It's a basic element in Descartes when he reflects on the lack of internal marks to distinguish between dreaming and waking, in Kant's distinction between a moral action and one that is perceptually indiscernible but not moral, in Heidegger's differentiation between authentic and inauthentic existence, in the metaphysical question of what the perceptive difference between a world in which God is present or absent, or between a world in which human beings have free will or are just zombies. The question of indiscernibles is clearly a philosophical topic, but it is a theological one as well. And even though Danto does not explicitly claim it, he works with that assumption as demonstrated by his concern with the examples and concepts. In the book devoted to Andy's later work, he explicitly claims that this question of the difference between exactly a thing, one of which is up and which is not, is similar to a religious question that has to do with the fact that there has to be a difference that is God and a man that is not. The example he gives is the following, I quote, "Imagine that there was Jesus' age in Jerusalem who looked enough like Jesus that the two were often confused for one another, even those who knew well. The difference could not have been more momentous than that. Confusing a God with a mere human being is toute proportion gardée," he says in French, like confusing a work of art with a mere real thing, a thing defined through its meaning with a thing defined through its use. End of quote. In order to debate this analogy, Danto adopts the term transfiguration, a concept which gives the title to one of his most famous works, as I said, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, which he draws from fiction one described in a novel by the Catholic novel Muriel Spark, and explicitly asserts that the idea derives from the Catholic concept of transubstantiation. We see that Danto is not theologically rigorous at all. In some other places, Danto consciously and explicitly selects transfiguration rather than transubstantiation, even though it seems prima facie that this latter would have proven more effective for achieving his theoretical goal. This lack of theological precision is a constant in Danto's work, and many times it would lead him to a philosophical cul-de-sac, as in the present case. Danto's definition of transfiguration is as follows. Transfiguration is a religious concept. It means the adoration of the ordinary, as in its original appearance in the Gospel of St. Matthew, it meant adoring a man as a god. That's his definition. Of course, it's wrong, but that's the definition he works with. Among the synoptic Gospels, Danto quotes Matthew's version for no clear reason, and the text reads what you can read there. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There, in their presence, he was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as dazzling as light. And suddenly, Moses and Elijah, and well, you know perfectly the text. By this analogy, Danto seems to mean we can see something as something other in virtue of something. Pop art, remember Warhawks, turns commonplace things that are meaningful for people by raising them to the status of high art. As the apostles, according to Danto, when they adore man, to Danto, the issue of transfiguration is interpretation, that for him is a constitutive fact, not just an explanatory one. If there is no interpretation constituting a work of art as such, there is no work of art. Namely, there is no work of art prior to an interpretation. It seems that interpretation transfigures objects, but that using the term is not consistent with what he wants to convey, since the narrative of transfiguration expressly claims that these changes, whiteness, shine, are what allow the disciples to do what Danto claims they do, adoring a man as a god. And that is not something Danto considers a necessary condition for something to be deemed a work of art, this kind of perceptive difference. We have the other theological term expressly rejected by Danto, which maybe could do, transubstantiation. This concept, I do not have to explain it here, has less to do with how things look than with what things are. It means an ontological change that excludes a priori any perceptible difference. When we are in the presence of transubstantiated realities, we do not see any difference between them and their corresponding not transubstantiated realities. So it seems this term, which would be much more useful to explain what the difference between Warhol's Brillo boxes and the commercial ones is, to some extent akin to the difference between bread and wine and the body and blood of Christ, toute proportion gardée, I would say now. Even though Danto explicitly rejects this term, he never provides a clear reason, but I'll offer a possible one in due course. He uses the concept thereof sometimes when he speaks of transfiguration, so he's mixing concepts. And in using it, he collects some of the different approaches to what it is for something to become the body and blood of Christ. Sometimes he seems to use Zwingli's approach, according to which the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist has to be understood symbolically. Zwingli claims that if the is of "this is the body of Christ" is taken literally, the body of Christ should be visible and must be physically and tangibly present. But to him, the is replaces means. Likewise, Dante talks about the is of artistic identification. For example, this figure, just here, in this right corner, is, you only see the legs, represents Icarus. Someone could claim that in the picture he only sees paint in a painting, and he is right. That means he has not done, of course, the artistic identification that constitutes it a work of art. This is really Zwingli. The one who cannot master the will be able to see bread. If we have the right theory, we can see something as something else, and this theory, in Dante's case, involves not only theories of art, but also theory that shows through the work. Someone who anything about what's going on in the Western art in the 60s would be unable to see the bread, but no Christian tradition would be unable to see bread and wine as body and blood. This is of artistic identification is, according to Dante, consistent with the literal falsehood of the identification, as it is the case Zwinglian approach to the species. The is of religious identification, in this sense, claims that the bread means the body, but literally is bread. Dante, in this aspect, the is of artistic identification resembles identification. For example, when I say that Juliet is the sun, but differs than the mythical identification, the sun is Phoebus' chariot, and different from religious identification, the bread and the wine are the body and blood of Christ. Dante says, in all these cases, literal falsity is inconceivable. Here is the place where Dante shifts gears. This religious identification must be the Catholic one, not the Zwinglian, where that fact is assumed. So Dante moves indistinctly, without much thought, between these theological approaches, the symbolic, Zwingli, and Aquinas, as one clear as if Dante set narrow exactitude are agreeing. But the Catholic approach does not fit well either. As Elizabeth Anscombe claims, transubstantiation is a conversion of one physical reality into another, the living Jesus Christ, coming to be of a new substance out of an old one, as in the case of a chemical change. It does not seem easy to make change of these with Dante's parameters. Furthermore, Dante never provides a transubstantiative procedure. This is very difficult to pronounce for me. So a procedure to explain how we transubstantiate. Because that could take him too close to George Dickey's institutional theory. George Dickey is a disciple of that. He created the institutional theory as the interpretation of Dante's art world, understood as an institution that resembles completely and exactly a church. And so, in order to explain how something becomes a work of art, Dickey expressly refers to a sacramental model, the baptism, in which a candidate is presented to an institution, the art world, that embodies a historical tradition in order to be admitted as a part of that. At some point, Dante, despite criticizing Dickey for claiming this, also says that interpretation is something like baptism, not in the sense of giving a name, but a new identity, a participation in the community of the elect. We can take the schema of Catholic sacramentology to understand Dante's view, taking the constitutive interpretation defended by him as the form of the sacrament. As without the form, as Augustine says, water is just water, without the constitutive artistic interpretation, the object is just a banal object. This allows us to interpret Dante's art world as the deposit of the tradition that nurtures the artistic faith, so as the place that provides the background intention of the artistic to create a work of art. A basic premise of those intentional accounts of the work of art, an artistic intention is a necessary condition for something to be regarded as art. Dante is also one of its representatives. For him, artworks are objects thrust into the world with the intention that they be works of art. What does that mean? Who has the intention? Is it enough that an artist has the intention of turning something into a work of art for it to become such a work of art? In order to make a work of art, one needs to know what a work of art is, or to have the intention of doing what the art world does. The art world is the instance that provides this kind of institutional intention, as it happens in Catholic theology. What the art world as such intends is not clear at all. By contrast, Catholic theology is clearly thinking emphasizes the intention of the priest in acting on behalf of the church in order for the religious act to bring about its effect. That is expressed through the words pronounced in every sacrament. So the minister has to be aware to some extent of what the church intends in the celebration of the sacrament. Otherwise, this is not valid. That is exactly the model George Dickey develops for art theory. And so the debate between Danto and Dickey is ultimately an ecclesiological quarrel between two ways of understanding what the art world is. Either an institutional church with powers to confer statutes, or a spiritual community of shared conceptions guided just by some sort of Hegelian absolute spirit. There are some other reasons not foreseen by Danto that make his choosing of transfiguration maybe right in the end. The biblical passage he quotes, for example, is not about the absence of perceptive difference between a God and a man, as he supposes it to be, but about the fact that Jesus can appear as the God he really is only within the religious tradition to which he belongs, represented by Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, exactly like an artwork can only be the work of art it is within our art world. Or we can highlight the eschatological characters present in the narrative to develop Danto's account of the end of art. That's another very important topic in Danto. These are some examples of how aesthetic theology can proceed. I'm almost done, I'm almost finishing. Danto is just an example of using theological concepts and reducing arguments in theory of art. There are many others. Most of the philosophical models about the creation of a work of art resemble the different logical doctrines about creation. The artist as a genius is a secularization of the nominalist God, and the discussion whether an artist follows rules or they are rather an obstacle for his creativity is analogous to the debate between realists and nominalists in medieval thought respect what an omnipotence amounts to. Theological ideas are present in the debates about how to interpret a work of art and what is the role of the author in that interpretation. The death of the author, a successful continental philosophy of art in the second half of the 20th century, is the death of God and opens up the possibility of maximizing the value of the work of art. The idea of aesthetic experience is a sophisticated elaboration of the idea of taste. This, as it is presented in Hume's standard of taste, becomes good taste, and it becomes a standard when it's the taste of the true judges, those free from any organic defect, among other defects, and not spoiled by some disorder. Hume says, I quote, "The true standard of taste and beauty is the agreed verdict of people like that, wherever they are to be found." Hume wonders where the judges are to be found. I am going to tell you. They are the blessed, whose noses will perceive the differences of smells, and the same applies to taste, touch, and so on. It's not that Hume says, I'm going to think theologically about that. It is rather that taste and aesthetic experience are thought by means of the same categories as beatitude was thought before. To conclude, I would continue longer developing analogies and showing theological analysis within the realm of the theory of art. But I think what I mean by theological aesthetics must be clear by now. I'm sure that this movement also has a theological meaning in a double sense. First of all, some of the contents of religion have passed to art, and that means something for our way of thinking, depicting, representing, or approaching God. Maybe we have to look at the art world as a locus theologicus, again, not just as a reservoir of materials, but as a place of manifestation of the divine. Secondly, it is possible we have to recover for some branches of theology, for example, apologetics, what Kant called aesthetic judgments, which embody the space of the postulated consensus, the alleged agreement a priori, as if everyone should like what one likes, without the possibility of giving a conceptual ground for that judgment. That has always been the structure of the religious judgment, in which one supposes also that agreement a priori in the beliefs, without the possibility of forcing that agreement. I don't know anyone who has become a believer after recognizing the probative character of any of the various ontological arguments. But the arguments that have this aesthetic structure as Peirce's neglected argument, for example, have really given rise to thought, as Paul Ricoeur said about symbols. The aesthetic approach to the real assures that the world is not indifferent to us, since it suits our cognitive faculties. As Susan Neiman again says, to judge nature to be beautiful is to feel satisfaction. If I had made the world, I would have done it just like that. To judge nature to be sublime is to be aware of something surpassing any capacities I ever dreamed. However much greater I imagine my creative powers, they would never suffice to do that. This is already a theological approach that understands the world as a creation of God, without the need of developing an analytical argument that will always elicit disagreement a posteriori. After this process of exchange between the religious and the artistic, I conclude that dwelling religiously is in some way dwelling aesthetically. Now we have new tools to think about the religious and about our access to God in terms that do not reduce either to a conceptual structure. We then become enfranchised once we are starting to think art with theological categories. The great theologians, Aquinas among them, have been very aware of the fact that what they have written compared with what they have lived, videtur ut palea, seemed like straw. Thank you very much. If the question is easy, because I have to repeat it, so mhm, mhm, mhm. That's really interesting. I don't have the answer. Well, the question is when does the moment of interpretation occur in the narrative of the Transfiguration? I'm sure there are theologians here who can reply or answer this question better than I can. But the thing is that these kind of questions, if we apply the narrative to philosophy of art, are the kind of questions that aesthetic theology should develop and ask. For example, I don't have the answer because I'm not a theologian, I'm not a Bible scholar. So,
Well, I guess I'm asking more in terms of
mhm, that's right. Yeah. Mm,
it seems to me, well, that if the act of interpretation is so crucial
that's
to the
right.
transfiguration
That's
that
right.
occurs, where is that and when does, and if possible, when does that act of interpretation occur?
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, in Dante I think it's the basic point, but he just claims that the interpretation is the basic element in turning something into a work of art. But I don't think he takes advantage of his own reflection in order to specify that moment. Yeah, but that's something we could do well.
Because if I could just go one more step, it seems to me that there's a question about who does the interpreting
Mhm.
and on what basis does the interpretation
Mm.
take place.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a quarrel, and Dante would say that the right interpretation and the constitutive interpretation is the artist's interpretation. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. He's completely in favor of this authorial reading, but not all scholars agree on that. So the thing is that. I was saying that at some point, some people try to get rid of the authority of the author, if we can say that, so that the work as such becomes independent. But also, to my mind, also that has also a theological reading, because it's a kind of, well, that's something I wanted to say, but it was too long and too complicated. It's a reading that applies the idea of of Leibniz that we have to maximize God in every possible way. Every good action has to be attributed to God. And so now contemporary scholars try to think that the artwork or the right interpretation of the artwork is that which maximizes the meaning or the value of the artwork. So we get rid of the author. If the author says, well, I meant this or I intended that, no, you can't say that. The work is autonomous. It's a kind, at some point it becomes, in some reflections of philosophers, a kind of new substitute of God. So we think the artwork as something that has to be in some way praised, maximized, a kind of, how do you say, viceroy of God, yeah? And so I think this kind of ideas that I found them really fruitful are the example of this aesthetic theology, of thinking about the artwork with theological categories. But the thing is that, as far as I know, philosophers who are doing this are not very rigorous. You know, Dante mixing transfiguration, transubstantiation. When he talks about one of them, he uses different approaches, kind of summarizing all the debates along 2,000 years just to explain something. At some point, maybe it becomes a little bit darker. But I don't know. I think there's something here. And there's something, maybe I'm not answering your question, because But the thing is that I think that's something that is not only useful for philosophers, because there's a reservoir of arguments in theology so powerful. I was thinking, when I was writing this, something that already happened in philosophy of language, I think. So philosophers of language have discovered all this trend or this tradition in medieval ages. So they are just, discovering many resources that are really, really useful. And so I think in aesthetics is happening something like this. I have a small, story about Dante. Dante never spoke until 2003 on the question of beauty in art. Never. Art has nothing or had nothing to do with beauty. Beauty was a property that artists could use or not, but there was not this close relationship. And so a couple of years before, maybe 2001, he attended a meeting, and he said in that meeting that he was thinking about the possibility of writing a book on beauty, relating beauty to goodness and to truth. And so I said, well, that's not really new. And he said, well, and we were talking a little bit, and he said, yeah, I never studied medieval or Greek philosophy. And so that made me think. I said, well, maybe what he's trying to say is already a little bit, we could say, depicted or something like that in medieval theology. So, well, that was my idea. But just help me to clarify myself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, but that's not really new. I mean, all these kind of things are really, really old. I was thinking that the most famous work of art in 20th century is the Duchamp's Urinal. It's 1917, so it's 100 years old. So, and there's another famous piece. It's Manzoni. It's called Merda d'Artista, artist. You know what that means. And it's 1960 something. So the art world is repeating all these kind of things. But the examples, we can find many, many, many. But the real question to my mind is this: is art everything artists do? Well, that's something that I think it's clearly represented in the theory of genius, 19th century. But I think we don't share that. Some artists, they think they are still genius from 19th century, but not anymore. 19th century is far away. So Danto and his disciple Dickey are good in showing that you have to know something about the theory in order to make art. A genius just creates. He is not tied by anything, just creates out of himself. But contemporary artists can do things that the art world or the art history allows them to create. And so if the contemporary or current state of art makes you possible to present this kind of features or this kind of things as art, that's right. But the thing is that good? It's art, but is that good? Or is it really worthy? Both Danto and Dickey talk about classificatory approaches to art, not evaluative. If I say that something is art, I say that maybe it's good art, maybe it's bad art. We are used to think that some things can be art, and that means good. Oh, this is art because it's something good. But that does not have to be the case. The case is, okay, I'm doing art. And I say, okay, but that's horrible. So I don't know, I'm doing movies, yeah, and that makes me maybe a terrible, I don't know. So the idea is that I feel very safe, very comfortable with this idea of art as a classificatory concept. So there's a wonderful website. I invite you to visit it if you want. It's called MOBA, the Museum of Bad Art. And so you see terrible things, and we call them art. And they say it's art so terrible that it deserves to be preserved because it's terrible. And you see it, so it's art, but it's bad. So the idea of something being, well, the artist makes things, and well, could be terrible, and that's okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that's possible. I think Dante was not a theologian, and he was mixing many things. I think he was not aware of what he was, how many elements what he was putting together, and so I think that's a very good point for developing this maybe aesthetic theology. So I'm really learning a lot of things. I'm taking note, writing down everything. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Mm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. 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 No, I think you got it completely right. Yeah, my idea it was not because I think this work is more or less already done by Balthasar, the theological aesthetics. So my idea was just to do something different. When I was talking with Father Gabriel about this, at the beginning, I think he understood I was going to talk about theological aesthetics. I said, no, my approach is something different. I'm not going to take this theological approach to beauty or to art and things like that, but the other way around. So the idea is that I think in the secular world, there's a kind of something is happening. I see this in philosophy, especially in aesthetics. Something is happening that all the concepts of theology, classical concepts, are just being revived in some very interesting way. Even though they are secularized, but they still have a role to play. And so I think we have something here we can learn, because I think that's also a sign of the times. I think we have to see why art has become so important and why we are thinking about art in terms of theological categories. I have a last example to give. When I was in Colombia, I had the opportunity to go to the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And there was a exhibition, I could say, I don't know if a wonderful exhibition, but a work by Mauricio Catalan, that it was a golden toilet. And the golden toilet was in the toilet. So they took the real toilet, they put the golden toilet, and you were going to the toilet to do what people do in the toilet. And so there was a long line, 2 hours waiting just to go to the golden toilet. And I thought to myself, what are these people looking for? What are they waiting? What do they expect? Well, we know what they expect to find there, no? But there's something in the art world that has taken so much from the religious perspective and from the theological way of thinking that I think there's something that we have to think about. So it's maybe, as I was saying, maybe art is again a place, a locus theologicus, a place we have to think about, not just using art for our purposes or something like that, but thinking art as a kind of revelation of the divine. Contemporary art, even this, I don't know if good or bad art or whatever, but something we have to think about. And so maybe this approach could be useful for that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.